The genealogy in Genesis chapter 5 has a really weird number pattern. Have you noticed that, or have you heard that from anyone? And it's been taken by the critical scholars who are quick to grasp at any straw as evidence that it doesn't reflect historical ages. Rather, it's a pattern that later people wrote in there trying to make some vague spiritual point that they don't have a good explanation for. And the numbers aren't real. And, I have another video about the long ages in Genesis chapter 5 and how that wasn't all humans didn't live to extraordinary lengths of time in the early days of humanity there, but just those that were in the line of Messiah, just those that were a part of the clan of Adam there and were in fellowship with the Lord. The Lord was present with the clan of Adam and the line of Messiah in a very real way before the relations went sour, and he said, I won't strive with these guys forever. I'll give it 120 more years, and then I'll have the flood wipe them out. But that's another story. Let me outline the problem here, and then I'll go over the real solution. And to do it, I had to do a little, I guess, historical scholarship myself, and I'm not good at it. I'm not really qualified to be a critical historical scholar, but it's just that they are so deficient and they're ignoring so much that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit for me to pick in this area, because they're all ignoring the possibility that it could be a historical document. And so even someone like me who's not very good at it, I can still come in and exploit that environment and find some things out just because they're all ignoring it. But here's the problem. In the Masoretic text, this 29 out of 30 numbers, it's 28 out of 30 numbers in the Septuagint. And the exception is Methuselah and Methuselah's son in the Septuagint. But all the numbers end in 5 or a multiple of 5 or 5 plus 7. So it's either a multiple of 5 or a multiple of 5 plus 7. All the numbers in the genealogy, except for Methuselah, and again, Methuselah and his son in the Septuagint version, they end in 0, 2, 5, or 7. None of them end in 1, 3, 4, 6, 8, or 9. Now, what are the odds of that happening by chance? Well, one fellow I was dialoguing with said the odds were about 1 in 3 trillion, that just by chance none of those numbers would be present. All of them would be by 5 or by multiple of 5 plus 7. Well, that sounds suspicious, doesn't it? And those who are quick to be suspicious say, aha, there you go. That's proof. That's just some rabbis or priests writing that document later. They filled in the numbers. They did it this way to make some strange spiritual numerological point that we just don't know. And that's their hypothesis to explain this odd number pattern. Well, I have a much better explanation than that, but it has to do with the tablet theory, and they don't want to consider the tablet theory. They've dismissed it unfairly. They haven't tinkered with it to see if it works better or not. If you tweak it a little bit, it does to explain the data, explains the data much better. They still don't want to touch it, but basically the tablet theory is when Moses wrote Genesis down, he wasn't going from a blank slate. Early Genesis, at least, the first 36 chapters, he had tablets from his ancestors. He had tablets from the patriarchs of the Bible. And when it says these are the generations of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, it's really saying these are the records or the account of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And those 11 times it says these are the generations of, at least 9 or 10 of them, they're not meaning it's a genealogy. They're meaning this is a record or a story. It may have a genealogy slapped onto the end of it, but really there's a narrative there. And he got those, and that's what early Genesis is. And so Noah was going through ancient genealogical records when he translated and compiled early Genesis. And this strange number pattern is not evidence that priests wrote Genesis much later. It's evidence for the tablet theory. And I'm going to explain how. But this is the problem. How do you explain the oddity of this pattern in years? Now, I do want to point out that when our critic friends are faced with data showing how improbable something is, like life to arise on its own, or the universe to be constructed the way it is, balanced so that we can be here, they're very quick to dismiss it. They say you're just playing with numbers. You're calculating the odds poorly. None of that matters. We're not going to even consider that. But when they see something like this, suddenly this kind of evidence does matter. So they're being hypocrites about it. They're not being consistent. They're not facing up. But we want to face up. We don't want to be like they do and say, oh, here's some unusual odds. When it's in our favor, we'll use it for an argument. But when it's against our favor, we'll ignore it. No, we want to go ahead and address the argument. And that's what I want to do. So they're making an argument based on the same kind of evidence that we use when we talk about the anthropic principle in the universe as evidence for God and various other things like that. So let's address that evidence next. So here's what I did that came very close to being historical scholarship is I thought about the problem and I put myself in the shoes of the people that might have been alive at that time, the audience of the day, like they like to do, and how they would have measured time. And I thought about that compared to what I know about the astronomical events in the heavens, and came up with a hypothesis. And then I looked for historical evidence that might support that hypothesis and absolutely found it. So I'll go through the process with you here briefly, not in detail, but basically the problem with keeping time is they really thought a lunar calendar was very important back then. They followed the sun. Well, a lunar month is about 29 and a half days, 29.53, varies a few hours each month. So that equals a 354-day year if you're going with 12 lunar cycles. So that's a pretty short year compared to our current year of 364 and basically a quarter days a year. And that 364, that solar cycle, they like to get the months even back then. They couldn't have 12 even months with 364 and a quarter days. So they basically just did it roughly and said there'll be 12 30-day months, a 360-day solar year. We'll do that. When things get out of whack, we'll make a calendar adjustment. But we'll start with 12 30-day months and have a 360-day solar year and a 354-day lunar year. Well, those don't line up either, at least not on a year-by-year basis. But you know how they do line up? On a 5-year basis. On a 5-year basis, the 360-day years and the 354-day years, they line up again. So the lunar month and the solar month can be realigned every 5 years. And what that means is a 5-year pattern is important. Further, if you have a 354-day year, that's going to fall behind your solar year. You'll be, indeed, on the real year, it's going to fall behind. So you'll be 9 days behind your 360-day, or 6 days behind your 360-day solar year, or about 10 days behind your actual 364-day solar year. What do you do about that? Well, the way they handle it, and I say they, I found some evidence for this, like the way the Babylonians did it, and really the way the Vedics did it. Lined up with what I'm saying very closely. And I thought that was interesting because, and I've got another video about who were the Nephilim and the sons of God. I don't buy the angels mating with human women business. I think that's a fairy tale. The sons of God were another tribe that the daughters of Adam, basically they formed a coalition, as it were, against a third people whom the giants in Canaan were among the last of, but It was a different, and I've got to see that video, but basically those people might have been related to the ones who later developed the Vedic calendar. So I thought it was very interesting that the Vedic system is even closer to what I'm describing, because they had this. They had a 5-year cycle where things realigned. But the Babylonians had a system that was kind of close to that, and there can be little doubt that the Babylonians were influenced by and from the same area as where Abraham came from, and where the earlier patriarchs of the Bible were supposed to have come from, Noah and Mount Ararat, for example. So every 2 years, you'll be about 20, maybe 21 or 22 days behind. Every 3 years, you'll be 30 to 33 days behind. So that sort of suggests what you do, right? If you just wait, sometimes you wait 2 years, sometimes you wait 3 years, and you just add a month to that year. So you may have a 354-day year 1 year, then you may have a 354-day year that adds a month of 20 days the next, and you're even. Or you might have 3 years, 354, and then that next one, you add maybe a 30-day month instead of a 20-day month, and you bring it, realign it with your actual calendar on that 5th year, where everything realigns. The 360-day calendar and the 354-day calendar meet again. And the Babylonians had a system like this, but we don't understand its origins. We don't know enough about its origins. We think that the extra month was added in an ad hoc way by each local priest or whatever to get the sun and moon and stars to realign. Later on, there was a classical Babylonian calendar. And a classical Babylonian calendar had 2 cycles, an 11-year cycle and a 19-year cycle. Guess what? That's 30 years. So it's really the same thing the Vedics were doing. They had a 30-year megacycle, just like I was suggesting, where the lunar calendar and the solar calendar, or the 360-day calendar, lined up. And so 5-year periods were equal length in time. The length of years did what in those very early days before things got formalized? It varied, didn't it? Could have been 354 years, could have been 360, or it could have been one of those years with an extra month, in which case it was either 20 days longer or 30 days longer. So if you're recording, and by the way, the Babylonian calendar and that 19-year cycle, they had a complicated system. They didn't add just 2 years, then 3 years, but they had a series of time where they would add more 3s than 2s, or vice versa, I forget. But the point is the same. The 5-year cycle was broken up into a 2-year period and a 3-year period, and that's what it's important here. So, imagine you're recording long lengths of time. Do you use years? No. The years in that age varied in length. You use the bigger unit. Let's call it a quin. The Vedics had a name for the 5-year period. So, and I forget at the moment what that was. But then the Babylonians, they would have the 5-year periods too, in the sense that they had 2-year and 3-year periods. But then later, when they formalized it, they required, I think, more 3 years than 2 years. So they didn't stick with it. To get more precise later on, they, instead of having an equal number of 2 years and then 3 years and even it out, they changed the cycle and added more 3s and less 2s, or vice versa. I can't, but the details are unimportant. What's important is that you can see how someone would use time in 5-year increments, or if they made it past the 5 years but didn't get to the 3 years of the next cycle, they would give them credit for 7 years. And that explains exactly the number pattern in Genesis chapter 5. Moses got a document with the family records. They didn't use quin anymore. They didn't use 5 cycle periods anymore. They had used years. And so he converted that into years, but he's converting from a big unit to a smaller unit, so it just happened to be the same last digit every time. It's just like saying if someone was born in 1960 and they died in the year 2000, they live 40 years. Well, not necessarily. If they were born late in 1960 and died early in 2000, they might have only lived 39 years. You don't know, because when you got to go down to months to get the smaller details. So it's the same thing with this. They were measuring it in 5 cycles of 5 years, except if they made it past one cycle, but into the 2-year portion of the 5-year cycle, but didn't make the 3-year portion, they gave them credit for what? A 2-year period. They went 7 instead of 5. And this would explain all the data. Not only does it explain all the data, but I did a little math test, and I thought, if that was what was going on, how often would the numbers end just randomly in some end with a 7, multiple of 5 plus 7, as opposed to just a multiple of 5? And my calculation showed that would be 25% of the time. 25% of the time, if it was just random, if this is what was going on, the numbers would end in a 7 instead of a 5. Or, of course, the 7 would be shown as a 2 at some point, sometimes. And lo and behold, you go and look at the actual numbers and figure out that was 27%. So very close to the predicted 25%. The actual time that the 7 and the 2 shows up is 27%. Very close to the 25% that would show up if what I am explaining happens. Now, I can even, and I've got a written article. I'll put the link to it. It's super long because I did a winding journey to do this, but it'll explain it in more detail. I'll put it in the description section of the video if you want it in writing with the math spelled out. But that just leaves, okay, what about Methuselah and Lamech in the Septuagint version? I think because he was dealing with records over generations, the more recent records added a new wrinkle, okay? And the new wrinkle was, if you didn't quite make it to a year, or if you went just a little over a year, they had a way to not I say a year, that 2-year period, if you went, or a 5-year period, instead of having either, hey, they made it, they lived into this 5-year period, or they lived into this 5-year period and 2 years beyond it, they had another note that came up with a little more sophisticated, saying they died just before that time. So instead of, or just after that time. So instead of ending in a 7 or a 2, it could end in a 3 or an 8. Or instead of ending in a 0, it could end in a 9. Instead of 5, it could end in a 4. If it had this little marker that they didn't have for the first 8 generations, or 7 generations, but once you got to Methuselah, they did. And so that's why the number pattern changes at Methuselah. Now, can we prove any of this? No, we can't prove either way. It's always going to take a little faith. But I would urge you, if you're curious about it, to check out where I wrote it down. Put yourself through the torture, I guess, of reading my long, convoluted article about it. But there's no logical reason, unless you just a priori refuse to accept that people could live long ages, even if the Lord God was with them every day, healing them of diseases they didn't know they had. There's no reason those numbers in Genesis chapter 5 can't be real numbers. The long or the odd number pattern is not evidence that priests made it up much later. It's evidence for the tablet theory. It's evidence that the data is much older. It was from a time when they hadn't quite worked this year thing out yet. And they measured long periods of time in 5-year cycles with a 5 or a 7-year cycle if someone lived a little bit into the next 5-year cycle but didn't make it halfway through. So that's just one. There's so many things. Really, they keep throwing up proposals and hypotheses and ideas as to why Genesis couldn't possibly be history, couldn't possibly be taken at face value. And it goes beyond face value. It really does go beyond face value. You can't take everything at face value, but it's history. It's an historical narrative. I don't think we have the narrative right, because the truth about it is it's better than the fundamentalists are saying, not worse. It's actually more Christ-centered. It's more obvious once you understand what the narrative is really saying, that whoever was behind this knew all along about Jesus and the atonement. So I hope you're intrigued by that, but I do thank you for your time and listening today, and may God bless you.